Hello everyone, my name's Viren. I am a social psychologist and I work here at Anglia Ruskin University. Welcome to the Cambridge Festival. I'm going to be talking to you about love, but before we begin, I want to say something a little bit difficult, which is that I love you. It might seem really weird to say I love you, but they're just three words and they mean a whole lot of different things to different people. When I say I love you, a collective you, it means something very different if I singled one of you out and if I said I love you to a single individual one of you. But when we talk about love, do we mean different things when we say I love a collective you versus an individual you? Or to ask a slightly different question, if I said I love you as a collective you, is that love any different to the love that I might say to or express towards my partner or towards my son who's now playing on his Switch in that corner down there? Is it any different to the love I might express for my pet dog, as a simple example? Are we still talking about the same love? Is it any different to the love I might express for a pizza? I love pizza. Is that the same love when I say I love all of you or an individual one of you? Are we still talking about the same love when I say I love pizza? Or what about if I love my hometown? Or if I love reading? If I love the colour blue? We're still talking about the same love. The answer to this question is actually really difficult to get to, but it gets to one of the most fundamental questions about the human condition. What do we mean when we say love? What are we talking about when we talk about love, when we say I love you to someone else? Answering that question is what I'm going to be trying to do today. Thankfully, attempts to answer this question actually have a very, very long history. About 3,000 years ago, the ancient Greeks came to think of love as an act of God. And specifically, the love god Cupid, or Eros as he was known to the ancient Greeks. Cupid is his Roman counterpart. But they essentially believed that this young man with wings and carrying arrows, this is how he was typically depicted by the ancient Greeks, was the cause of love. Now, specifically, they believed that he would go around flying about and shooting his arrows. And if you happened to be struck by one of Cupid's arrows, you'd fall in love with the very first thing that you set your sights on. And this gave rise to all kinds of weird stories in the ancient Greek texts about people falling in love with their reflection, or with statues, or with animals. So love for the ancient Greeks was reduced essentially to the scheming of an arrow-wielding love god. Love, in a sense, for the ancient Greeks was beyond human comprehension. We cannot understand, at least the ancient Greeks thought, what love is and why it occurs. It is simply down to the machinations of this love god. Later depictions, in fact, depicted Cupid, particularly in Roman art, or Roman-inspired art, as blindfolded. Now, this wasn't to give the sense that Cupid was blind or sightless, but rather to signify that he acted randomly, without thought, without consideration. He would shoot his arrows randomly at people, and if you happened to be struck by one of his arrows, you would fall in love. So essentially what the ancient Greeks and later the ancient Romans thought was that love was an act of God that was random. It was beyond our human comprehension and in its randomness. Now, by around 1200 BCE, Cupid's arrow had begun to be reinterpreted in terms of the latest developments in optical theory. The philosophers of the Middle Ages, for example, believed that Cupid was still involved somehow, but it wasn't his arrows that caused us to fall in love, but light. It was light that caused us to fall in love. Light was essentially reflected down into our hearts. And as our hearts were set on fire by the light that we see, our hearts made a decision about whether or not we loved the person that we were looking at. So to give you one example, going back to my collective view, I love all of you. And the reason why I might love all of you is because light speeds from you, your collective identity, into my eyes. And my eyes now act as a mirror. They are reflecting light down to my heart. And that sets my heart on fire. My heart is on fire and it's still beating while it's on fire. And somehow my heart now makes a decision. I love you. I love you because my heart is on fire. So essentially, love becomes a feeling that becomes associated with the heart. And really, it's at this point in time, for the first time, that love is specifically associated with the heart. And it's a very interesting thinking experiment or a thought experiment to think, well, what if it wasn't associated with the heart? What if we associated in 1200 with the foot, for example, that light reflected your vision or your image of you down to my foot, and it's actually my foot that makes that decision, and my foot's on fire. It's an interesting thought experiment, but we've become so enraptured with this idea that love is associated with the heart. It's such a difficult thing to decouple now. But here's the important question. Why does my heart choose one person? Right now, I'm getting light reflected down to my heart from lots of different people, from many of you. But ultimately, my heart chooses one person, or at least one individual, maybe sometimes two or three, but most of the time we're talking about one individual. Why is it one person that my heart chooses and not everyone? Why isn't everyone setting my heart on fire? Well, the philosophers of the Middle Ages thought that some light was deceitful. They didn't know why, and they didn't know how, but they thought that some light that comes into my eyes is deceitful. It's cheating me. If one of you was, for whatever reason, sending deceitful light into my eyes and down into my heart, while it's set on fire, is being deceived by you. It's not reality anymore. I'm not really in love with you. I'm in love with a vision, a false vision of who you are. So love in the Middle Ages came to be seen as something deceitful. We are deceived into love. We don't fall in love because we choose to be in love. We're deceived into love by light that comes into our hearts. And implicit here was the assumption that love isn't actually something desirable. Right now, in today's world, we all want to be loved. We all look for love. We want love in our lives. In the Middle Ages, if you were in love, it meant something very different. It meant you were sick. It meant you were inflicted by a sickness that needed to be cured. Initially, this was thought to be caused by an excess of bile. Later, it became associated with womanhood and was associated with disorders of the womb. But essentially, the idea was that if you were inflicted by love, it was something that caused you to be sick. And very similar ideas were also common and popular in Japan and India and China around the same period. If you were unlucky enough to be inflicted by love, you would have to go and see a physician, and they would try and cure you. In about 1500, for example, in about 1200, the physician Galen famously said that if you were inflicted with love, you had to be cured through purgatives, laxatives, or bloodletting. So they would cut a hole in your body somewhere and let out your blood in an attempt to readjust your constitution. So you really didn't want to be in love. The entirety of John Gower's poem, Confessio Amantis, or Lover's Confession, written in the 14th century, for example, centers around a man who goes to Venus and says, I am so in love that I do not know what to do anymore. It feels like a sickness that cannot be cured. So he goes to Venus and he pleads to Venus, please, please, please cure me of this love that I feel. And Venus looks at him and goes, you are really sick. Here is an ointment I will give you, and I will anoint your heart. And this is the only way that he could be cured. And the entirety of this poem is about this person's sickness because he's in love. And later texts in the 15th and 16th century talked about different types of cures for love. If you were lucky enough to be a man, or particularly a nobleman, what you would be offered by physicians would be sex. You'd be told, go and have some sex. Now, if you were a woman in love, you were not offered such sexual liberties. You were told to go and get married instead. Now, it really is only in the Middle Ages that we begin to see a version of love that we understand, at least we understand today. Around the 15th century in Western Europe, there emerged a very specific literary trope. This was not reflected in real life at the time. It emerged initially in literary traditions, so writing, in writing from the 15th century onwards. There was an important literary conception called courtly love. Now, courtly love was typically associated with the noble court, and it typically meant that what an individual would do was demonstrate his love, typically for a woman, through acts of gallantry, acts of heroic quests. And probably the example that some people at least will be familiar with, and probably the most familiar example from the time, is the love that Lady Guinevere expresses for Sir Lancelot. In fact, Guinevere in Arthurian legend is married to King Arthur, and the love that she develops later with Sir Lancelot is actually a forbidden love. But one of the key things here is that Lancelot has to win her love. He has to act heroically at multiple points in different versions of the story that are told to win her love. And that's the version that we talk about when we talk about romantic love, at least today. And so here for the first time, we see love as a means not necessarily of advancing your family position, not about gaining wealth, but about true love, about wanting to be with someone because you care about that person. It was based on character. It was based on actions. For the first time, love becomes something to do with how you feel about someone else. And by the late 15th century, this form of love becomes codified for the first time. By codified, I simply mean it becomes written down and becomes almost a sort of implicit law, an implicit rule that people are meant to follow. Three things occur. First, love becomes codified as something that can grow. Remember, the ancient Greeks talked about it as being something spontaneous, something instantaneous. You get struck by an arrow, and now you're suddenly in love. By the 15th century, love was something that grew. It took time. Sir Lancelot's love for Lady Guinevere doesn't occur magically. It took a long time for it to develop. Secondly, it allowed for the first time feelings of jealousy. If someone else loved the same person that I love, I'm allowed now to feel jealousy. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, it forbids love for more than one person at the same time. I can express love for one person, but I cannot express love for more than one person at the same time. And at the same time, love, at least courtly love, as it was codified in the 16th and 15th centuries, explicitly removed sex. There was to be no sex between the two people who are in love. It is not about sex. It is about demonstrating your compassion, your care for the other person. So love comes to be seen as something dynamic. It can change over time. It depends on who else is involved in this story. But it is typically expressed as a feeling that I have for one true other person, essentially my soulmate. And I go looking for this soulmate in real life. Now, for a very long time, this version of courtly love was thought to be a Western European conception. It was thought to have emerged in Western Europe, in literary traditions in Western Europe. It turns out it's actually also heavily influenced by, or at least Western European contact at the time, with Muslim Spain. So, for example, the notions of exalting one individual, of putting one person as your soulmate, and also love for the sake of love and not for financial gain or not for familial gain, can actually be traced back to Muslim writers from the 10th century, and particularly the Persian philosopher and writer Ibn Sina. He's known as Avicenna in Western Europe. Avicenna developed the idea of what he called a moral love. Love not for financial gain, not for any kind of thing that you might feel gratuitously. Love had to come because you were pure of heart. And it was only people who were pure of heart, who were completely innocent, who were able to truly love other people. Now, as the Western, as European nobility, and especially the knights, became people who we emulated, the ethic and lifestyle of courtly love became much more widespread, and particularly in Europe in the Middle Ages. Members of the aristocracy, for example, were schooled in how to behave in a courtly way, and that included things like chivalry, behaving in a chivalrous way, being kind to other people. It also involved things like demonstrating kindness, demonstrating compassion, and importantly here, in his teachings about what it meant to be a courtly lover, it was really always emphasized that you had to show the same actions towards all people, irrespective of class, irrespective of gender, irrespective of background. It was not something to be demonstrated to one individual, but to all individuals that you came across. Now, of course, over time, what that might mean is that you develop a strong feeling of pure love for one individual. Now, essentially what you have here for the first time is this idea that love is based on compassion, it's based on respect, it's based on kindness towards one another. But there's also an important caveat. The ancient Greeks depicted Eros in particular as a god of homoerotic love. They explicitly said that love could flourish between anyone, including people of the same gender. They also had Sappho, who played the same role for women. But by the medieval period, courtly love had codified love as something that can only occur between a man and a woman. And typically, the action is demonstrated initially by the man. It is the man who has to initiate love. A woman cannot initiate love. She can receive love and thereby reciprocate. But the idea that that the man had to initiate love became entrenched in courtly depictions of love. So here we have a basic definition of what love might be for the first time. Love is devotion. Love is courtesy. Love is kindness. Love is compassion for one another, but it has to be expressed by a man towards a woman, and only then can it be reciprocated. Now, this form of love became the dominant form of love by at least the early 19th century. The historian Howard Gadlin argues that this is primarily because of the rise of capitalism. And what capitalism did was essentially destroyed old communal ways of living, where we might have belonged to a community, where we might have belonged to a large family unit, which would have given us a sense of belonging. Once capitalism became the entrenched way of being for most people became atomized, became individualized, and they lost those communal relationships. Romantic love, in turn, came to provide what capitalism and industrialization took away. Individuals no longer felt a sense of kinship, no longer felt a sense of companionship, and they went looking for that in depictions of romantic love. Gadlin, in fact, argues that we would not have a conception of love as it is today were it not for capitalism. But this explains why we have an individualized form of love today. It doesn't really tell us what love actually is. The person who is often credited with the first scientific attempt at defining love is Sigmund Freud. In truth, Freud didn't actually set out to define love. And actually, if you read through his writings, nowhere does he explicitly talk about love. Often he talks about sexual relationships. But a lot of the kind of understandings of what love is today derive from Freud's original ideas, and particularly his ideas around psychosexual development. And some of these ideas are actually incredibly popular. And some of you might be familiar with some of these ideas. It's also widely misunderstood what he actually said. In a very simple sense, because I haven't got time to really go through it, but in a very simple sense, Freud believed that in childhood we begin to form our first sexual desires and sexual fantasies with our caregiver, with our primary caregivers, typically our opposite sex caregiver. Now, most people work through those fantasies and they come out healthier as the result. If you don't manage to work through those fantasies and those desires, you will begin to show adult neuroses. That's the very simple part of it. Now, in reality, Freud's ideas are incredibly sexist. They were hugely dependent on ideas that were common at the time about male fantasy in particular. They're also incredibly pseudoscientific. The key point, though, is that a lot of stuff that occurs in childhood can impact how we love as adults. And that's the thing that most psychoanalysts took from Freud today. So beginning in the 1960s, for example, the psychoanalyst John Bowlby developed his attachment theory. His attachment theory, in a very basic sense, simply suggests that people form different types of responses to the world, and that those attachment styles are shaped. By our relationships with our primary caregivers early in life. Bowlby, like Freud, believed that if you were able to work through those difficult relationships, particularly in early life, you come out healthier. Conversely, a lot of mental health problems, a lot of behavioral problems that we express as adults can be traced back to childhood. In later work, Mary Ainsworth and her colleagues developed Bowlby's ideas, particularly through observations of how young children in particular, interact with their primary caregiver. There's something called the strange situation. The strange situation is basically a lab-based technique where you get a child to come into, or you get a parent to bring their child, typically between the ages of 2 and 5. You bring them into a lab, and you then expose them to different strange situations. So a strange situation might be one where the parent leaves the room, and suddenly the child finds themselves on their own. They don't know what to do, and you observe what happens. Or while the child is playing on their own, you might send a stranger into a room and see how the child reacts to the stranger. The key point here is that Ainsworth developed this idea that different children, depending on how they have interacted with their parents and caregivers in the past, develop different attachment styles. And those attachment styles continue to have an impact on who we form relationships with and how we form relationships with people, with adults. In a very simple sense, love now becomes about your attachment style. Love is your attachment style, essentially. Here's a very simple test you can do if you want to determine your adult attachment style. On the screen are 4 relationship styles or 4 attachment styles for adults. All you need to do is work out which one best describes you. I won't read them out, but I'll give you 1 minute to work out which one you are. Remember the letter that goes with the statement. Remember that letter, because I'll explain it using the letters in a second. Right, anyone need a bit more time? Are we all good? All good? If you selected A, you're considered to have secure attachment. This is what we want all people to have, secure attachment styles. This means you have high self-worth, you trust other people, you're responsive to other people, and you have generally positive relationships with other people. If you selected B, you have what we generally call fearful avoidant attachment. This means you lack trust in other people. You do not trust other people to care for you. You are apprehensive about forming close relationships, and basically you do not trust other people to get close enough to you. If you selected C, top right there, you have what we call preoccupied attachment, which means your sense of self-worth is completely dependent on the relationships that you form. You're unable to form an independent identity of your own, and you typically rely on your relationships to tell you who you are. And finally, if you selected D, which is dismissive or dismissing avoidant attachment, you have a generally positive self-view of yourself, but you completely deny the impact that relationships have on you, and you deny the importance of relationships in your life. Now, in reality, most people don't just have one attachment style. If you selected A, doesn't mean you're always going to be an A. You might change depending on lots of different things that occur in your life, depending also on what we call a discursive relationship. So discursive relationship simply means it's not based on the individual itself, it's based on how you interact with other people. But in general, what these attachment styles tell us is how you might go about loving as an adult. Are you capable of love? As a very simple example, if you have a secure attachment style, it means you're capable of loving someone. It means you're capable of trusting and being close with someone else. Conversely, if you are fearful of relationships, then you're unlikely to be able to form positive and healthy relationships with other people. So in Ainsworth's view, and the view of many psychoanalysts now, love is basically predicated upon attachment. It may not be everything that love is, but love is predicated on your ability to form different forms of attachment style. And if you have secure attachment styles, then you're more likely to be able to love other people. Is attachment enough? Well, at about the same time that psychoanalysts were developing their theories of attachment, behavioral psychologists began to argue that attachment theories overlooked an important component, which was comfort. Now, this might seem really strange. When we talk about love, we don't often talk about comfort, and particularly we don't talk about touch as being an important component of love. In the 1950s, though, Harry Harlow began conducting a number of experiments with rhesus monkeys. I just want to tell you about one particular experiment that he conducted. He basically took these rhesus monkeys that when they were still young, infant rhesus monkeys. He took them away from their mothers, and he gave them 2 surrogate mothers. One of these surrogate mothers was made of wood and wire, but importantly, this surrogate mother had milk. She had a milk bottle, so she was able to feed. A second surrogate mother was made of cloth, terry cloth, nice soft cloth that you could touch. Let me show you what happened.
Let me show you a monkey raised on a nursing wire mother. Now here are 106's 2 mothers. As you can see, it was weaned on a wire mother. Here's baby 106. Watch.
He's going to the wire mother.
He's got to eat to live.
Oh, he's going back.
He's back on the cloth mother, and he'll stay on the cloth mother. Actually, this baby spends from 17 to 18 hours a day on the cloth mother and less than 1 hour a day on the wire mother.
Harlow basically found that the rhesus monkeys were spending more time with the cloth mother than they were with the mother that was actually able to provide milk. As you saw here, actually spent significantly more time with the cloth mother. In fact, if you then place the monkeys in a stressful situation, if you, for example, tried to scare them, what they typically did was run back to the cloth mother. If the cloth mother was available, they typically showed patterns of adjustment, secure attachment, essentially. Importantly, Harlow also then went on to conduct some unethical, by our standards at least today, experiments with these rhesus monkeys where he removed the cloth mother and then tried to scare the rhesus monkeys. Typically what he found was that the rhesus monkeys suffered quite extreme psychological damage. Most of them were not able to function as organisms after that point. Most were paralyzed in fear. They would typically hide under a piece of wood and not come back out again. Harlow's experiments were both highly controversial for that particular reason, but they were also highly influential because they set the stage for a different way of thinking about love. It was essentially a view of love that was based on neurochemical or neurochemistry, that's something neurobiological happening in the brain. After all, think of it this way. If this rhesus monkey is running back to its cloth mother every time, the cloth mother must be providing something. It's providing comfort. But what is that comfort? Well, Harlow argued that it was something triggered in the brain, and he didn't quite know what at the time, but later studies identified oxytocin as probably the primary neurochemical that is being triggered when we have comforting touch from other people. Oxytocin is today sometimes colloquially called the love hormone. In mammals, its primary function is actually to initiate uterine contractions during labor and childbirth. It also stimulates contraction of breast tissue, which then stimulates aids lactation after childbirth. However, the hormone's also been implicated in social bonding. Meet the prairie vole. The prairie vole is a unique mammal. It is a unique mammal because it's one of the few mammals that is monogamous. It is completely monogamous to an extreme sense. If, for example, a prairie vole loses its partner, it will choose to remain single for the rest of its life. It will not find a new partner. Studies of prairie voles have shown, for example, that oxytocin is released in the bloodstream at very high levels, typically after sexual activity between two prairie voles. So it's been suggested that oxytocin might be one of the primary contributors to formation of what we call a pair bond. Weirdly, there's also some studies which have shown that if a prairie vole is injected with oxytocin after the death of a former partner, they will pick up a new partner. So if you inject them with oxytocin, they will no longer remain monogamous for the rest of their lives. They now go and find a new partner. Interestingly, mothers that are injected or mother prairie voles that are injected with oxytocin will also adopt other infants as their own if they're injected with oxytocin. And this is all great for the prairie vole, but what about human beings? Well, we know that oxytocin plays a huge role in the immediate point after childbirth. Skin-to-skin contact, for example, is one of the main ways in which we introduce a surge in oxytocin in both the infant and the child, and that seems to trigger not just higher levels of attachment in the mother, but also higher levels of calm in the infant as well. Studies have also shown that if you give dads a nasal spray of oxytocin immediately after the birth of their child, and in the weeks following the birth of their child, if they take a spray of oxytocin, a nasal spray every day, they typically show higher levels of attachment. They feel more bonded with their child. And they also demonstrate greater attachment activities. They're more likely to read, play, and sing with their infant compared if they were not given a nasal spray. Oxytocin levels also remain at elevated levels in both parents in the months after the birth of the child. So we know it's involved in child bonding at least. Oxytocin may also be involved in experiences of love, though. For example, oxytocin is released into the bloodstream during orgasm, suggesting it plays an important role in sexual activity and sexual bonding, and it remains at a sustained higher level in most couples for about 6 months after they start their relationships. Interesting, one study found, I'm glad you got higher levels of oxytocin. One study found that if you ask people in relationships to think of their partners specifically, that alone is enough to trigger a release of oxytocin compared to if they were asked to think of an embarrassing memory. If you want to form actions of love, give your partner a nasal spray of oxytocin, because that's been shown to make them feel more generous, more kind, more compassionate towards their partners as well. So perhaps this is what love is. Love is oxytocin. Love is something that occurs in the brain. It's a neurochemical change that we experience in the brain, which is fine, but it doesn't seem like it's enough. In fact, it's not enough. In men, vasopressin has been found to play a similar role, particularly in child bonding. If you give dads sprays of vasopressin in the period after the birth of a child, they show the same reactions they do if they get a nasal spray of oxytocin. But other studies have found that other neurochemicals also play a role in that period after love. Serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine are all at higher levels in people who have just started dating, for example. These are all pleasure-inducing neurochemicals. They're at higher levels when we experience pleasure, when we experience fun things. Testosterone and estrogen are also at higher levels in people who have just started dating, particularly in the early stages of that relationship in the first 6 months. So perhaps if you chuck all of these different neurochemicals into a bottle, we get what love is. This is what love looks like. Love is basically a series of neurochemicals that we can put into a bottle and we can call it love. And in fact, some psychologists have tried to make this argument. Helen Fisher, who passed away last year, was one of the most important proponents of this idea that love is basically a series of neurochemical reactions in the brain. She argued, for example, that if you feel lust, if you feel passionate about someone, what that triggers initially is higher levels of testosterone and estrogen. And if you then feel an attraction for that person, for one individual, that will trigger higher levels of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. And it's that triggering of norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine, which is the feelings that we might have, that nervousness, the butterflies in your tummy, the lack of sleep, the lack of willingness to eat, and all those kind of associated things that we might associate with love is caused by the release of these neurochemicals. And it's only slightly in the longer term, if you form a long-term pair bond with someone, if you form a relationship with someone, that you see higher levels of both oxytocin and vasopressin. So maybe this is love. This is love because this is what happens in your brain when you're in love. Except that many psychologists quickly became disillusioned with this idea that love is just basically a series of things that are occurring in your brain. To give you a very simple analogy, if I choose to walk over here and stand over here now, something has happened in my brain. There are a series of neurochemical reactions that took place in my brain that said, move from one place to another. But that's not walking. We wouldn't call the things that are happening in my brain walking. It's the action of me moving from here to here that we call walking, not what's happening in the brain. And by the same route, we would not call, or at least most psychologists would find it very difficult to say what's happening in your brain is love. It may not necessarily be the full version of it. And in response, cognitive psychologists began to formalize the idea that there are actually different types of love. When we talk about love in the singular version, we're actually mistaking what it actually is. And what it actually is a number of different things that we call love. And this idea actually goes back all the way to Plato. Plato talked about a ladder of love. At the bottom, the kind of the basest level, you have a love for the physical body. When we see people, we physically lust after them. That's the worst kind of love, according to Plato. At the top of his ladder, he has love for wisdom and love for the essence of beauty. We look into a person's soul and we find their wisdom, we find the kind of true beauty, not the physical beauty. And for Plato, that was what love is. But modern conceptualizations of this idea that there are multiple or plural types of love can be traced back to Zick Rubin. Zick Rubin famously came up with a color wheel of love. But his starting point was getting us to think about what we mean when we say we like someone versus we love someone. Again, this is a simple test that you can all do. You don't have to think about a partner necessarily. Think of someone you're close to. It could be a friend, it could be a colleague, it could be someone you maybe met today. It doesn't really matter. Think about that person. What would tell you whether you actually love this person as opposed to simply liking this person? I'm not expecting answers necessarily, but just spend maybe 30 seconds thinking about this. How would you know if you loved someone as opposed to simply liking that person? What is the distinction? This was Zubin's answer. Zubin came up with this idea that there are actually a number of components to liking. But the main thing about liking is that you want to spend time with that person. You want to spend time with that person, they're a nice person, that's liking. Love for him was something different. It had to involve three things. Firstly, it had to involve intimacy, it had to involve attachment, and it had to involve a care for that person's needs as much as your own needs. That for him was love. And he used that to distinguish between love and liking. He said they were distinct things. You can want to spend time with someone but not love them because you don't feel a sense of attachment to them. You don't feel a sense of intimacy with that person, even though they may be fun to spend time with. Love had to be based on attachment. It had to be based on intimacy. It had to be based on care. And he went on to talk about different types of love. This is his color wheel, and the color wheel of love. At the bottom, you've got eros, which is a romantic or passionate type of love. It's the love that we feel when we really lust after someone. And then you've got storge. Storge is a more compassionate or familiar love. He talked about storge being the kind of love we feel for our family, for our children, or for our parents. And then at the top, you've got ludic love. Ludic love is a more playful type of love. It's the kind of love we want to have with people who we have fun with. And then you've got intermediary forms of love. You've got kind of mixtures of different things. I'm not going to bore you with all the details of this particular color wheel. Psychologists don't really talk about it very much because it was replaced by a different form of a cognitive model of love called built by Robert Sternberg. And it's known as the triangular theory of love. And it's the most common conception or common cognitive conceptualization of love today. Robert Sternberg's idea is very simple. It borrows from Zubin, but he says there are different types of love. At the top, you've got intimacy, which is basically a liking for someone, a compassionate, you want to spend time with that person. It's essentially an attachment to an individual. And then you've got commitment down at the bottom, which is a stronger or a conscious decision to stick with someone. And then you've got infatuation, which is a more romantic form of love, which is a kind of lusting kind of love. And then in between, you've got things where you combine different things. So, for example, fatuous love is passion with commitment. Companionate love is intimacy with commitment, and so on. Essentially, what you have here is a version where we can build up different types of love, and we can also then begin to measure your form of love. And again, you can do this if you want. If you are currently in a relationship, I might come to you and say, please complete my survey, which will tell me about your love style. So I'd like you to do this. If you are currently in a relationship now, what you can do is simply rate your answers, or rate how much you agree with each of these statements here, and I will tell you how to get your love styles in a second. Just remember your scores. Right, are we ready? To get your scores, you need your intimacy love style. You add up your score for items 1 and 4. To see how passionate you are, you add up your scores for 2 and 5. And then to see how committed you are, you add up your scores for 3 and 6. You generally want to have higher scores on all 3 components. That tells you have what Sternberg called a consummate style of love. You are passionate, you are committed, and you also liked your partner. Now, Sternberg went on to argue that people who complete surveys like this is a shorter version of an actual instrument that's used a lot in therapeutic care, but he argued that when you complete surveys like this, it gives you an insight into a person's love style, how they love their partners. And those scores, in turn, are very good at predicting things like relationship satisfaction, relationship length, how healthy the relationship is, and so on. So there are important outcomes to surveys like this. In Sternberg's view, as I said, the most complete form of love is consummate love, which is a combination of intimacy, passion, and commitment. Now, studies have interestingly suggested that this model of love, or how we understand love, is relatively stable across gender identities, at least in the West. Women and men conceptualize love in more or less the same way as this. So perhaps then this is what love looks like. This is what we think of when we think about love, and particularly when we think about consummate love. One problem with this model, though, it was based on research conducted primarily with university students in the United States. So typically young adults who fed in data into these models. It's also a top-down approach. And what I mean by that is Sternberg came up with this theory first and then went looking for data to support the theory. And I'll talk about why that's a problem in a second. But other researchers went about things a different way. They simply ask people to say what they think love is, or what the characteristics of love is. And this is what we call a bottom-up approach to defining love. The reason why we have to ask people to explain what they think love is because our language of love is bounded. And what that simply means is that we can have a conception of love in our heads, but we have to be able to verbalize it. We have to be able to say, this is what I think it is. And the simplest way to do this is to simply say, what do you think love consists of? When you think about love, what are the characteristics? And again, you can do this yourselves. If you think about love, what is the first or most important characteristic or feature that you think it consists of? Anyone brave enough to volunteer anything? So care for the other person's well-being. Anything else? We're going to make our own, we're going to define love for ourselves. We've got care for the other person. Anyone want to add anything else? Yes.
Compassion.
Compassion, good one. Do you all notice? Sorry?
Desire for intimacy.
Desire for intimacy. Are we noticing a pattern? Well, okay, so Beverly Ann Fair did exactly this study with a whole number of different populations, and they typically come up with all kinds of different things. They come up with more or less 50 different characteristics or traits that they believe are important. This is consistent across different communities, different cultures. You typically get more or less the same things. Then what you can do is rate all of these different things for how important they are in terms of your prototype of love. Now you get something very different. It's the things that all of you mentioned as well. Things like trust, friendship, compassion, companionship, and probably most importantly, concern for the other person's well-being are the things that people think about most when they think about love. They don't think about sex. They don't think about romance. They don't think about passion. They don't think about lust, which is not to say they're not part of the conception of love. They are important things, but they don't form the prototype of love when we think about what love is. In fact, this conception of love also seems to be the most common version of love outside of Europe and North America. In the 1950s and 1960s, for example, anthropologists like Margaret Mead, who's depicted here, Ralph Linton, Robert Lowy, among other people, went to different communities around the world and did exactly this study. They simply asked, what does love look like for you? What do you think love is? And in most cases, what they found was that love was a compassion for the other person's well-being, often removed from sex, often removed from passion, and almost always removed of lust. Lust was not a core conception of love. Margaret Mead, for example, famously talked about love being able to sit and talk and laugh together. And that was all love was. And that was her definition of what love was based on her anthropological research. Love is to be able to sit and talk and laugh with someone else. Nothing else. Imagine that as your definition of love. Just being able to sit and talk and laugh and nothing else. You don't need anything else because that's what love is for many communities. In fact, this form of love seems to be the kind of the initial basis of love for most communities around the world, including in Western Europe, as we talked about earlier. Of course, things have changed remarkably since the 1950s, and conceptions of love have changed remarkably since the 1950s. And most communities around the world, even today, now talk about love as involving things like commitment and passion and intimacy. The anthropologist Charles Lindholm argues this is a function of globalization. A version of love that was dominant in Western Europe was exported around the world. And we shouldn't see this process as entirely benign. It's not a benign process that occurred. In many parts of the world, it was European colonizers who went along and said, your version of love is not what we want. This is not the right way to love. You need to love the way we do. You need to love the way we exercise love. And so alternative forms of love, particularly non-sexual forms of love, were typically eradicated through laws, through rules, through governance, to the point where we now have a very common form of love across most communities around the world. However, even today, not everyone agrees that love can be conceptualized in the same way. For example, interviews with autistic adults who have been in at least one romantic relationship suggest that they think of love as a form of passion and a form of long-lasting infatuation. So if you go back to Sternberg's model, they think of it not in terms of intimacy and companionship and liking, but rather as a form of infatuation that lasts for a very long time. And again, for many autistic adults, sex is not part of that equation. They can feel infatuation, and typically they may even express the idea that they're asexual. They don't want to have sex, they're not interested in sex, but they care about this other person in a very intense manner. So perhaps Sternberg's model does offer us a way of thinking about love. And to be fair, other people, as I said before, because it's typically a top-down model, Sternberg came up with this idea, went looking for data that fit his theory. Other people have kind of said, well, that's not how we do research. We need alternative forms of alternative models, and there's now a quadruple model of love. Sternberg, in fact, revised his model. He calls it now a duplex model. He's got this, and he's got something on top, which is the stories that we construct about love. It's all become a bit messy. It's all become a bit mad. No one really has an idea of what the best model of love is anymore. But basically, this is where we are now, at least in psychology. Most psychologists will tell you, if you're talking about love, this is what it basically looks like, which is wonderful, except that's not where philosophy really is at. Now, I would argue that one of the things that all the different forms of love that we've looked at today all share in common is that it's an emotion that we feel, something that happens to us. Love is something that occurs. We fall in love. We are love-struck. Love hits us in the face. We fall in love. We feel love. It's essentially an emotion that occurs in my heart and nowhere else. Love in these perspectives is almost accidental. I don't build love. I don't construct love. It just occurs to me somehow, magically, like the neurochemicals in my brains. In the 1950s, though, the psychologist Erich Fromm took issue with the view that love is primarily something that occurs to us. Love is primarily an emotion, which he said made love feel easy. If you think about it as an emotion, it's an easy thing to experience. We experience anger, we experience happiness, we experience all kinds of things, but they don't require effort. And if you think about love as an emotion, it becomes something easy. Becomes something that's easy to do. In other words, love becomes, in his words, an accidental emotion that doesn't require effort. Instead, Fromm began his critique by agreeing with people like Charles Lindholm and Howard Gadlin and other people that in capitalist societies, we are isolated from one another. There is no real sense that we form communities with people, and we often don't have a sense of belonging. And that isolation means something very specific for individuals. It means they carry a form of baggage. They carry a baggage which tells them that they are isolated, they are alone, they're separate from other people, they're not part of something anymore. And that fills us with shame, it fills us with guilt, it fills us with all kinds of dread about life being alone. And we try and overcome this separateness, we try and overcome this isolation by finding forms of love with other people, particularly romantic love in our adult life. So love for Fromm was the solution for most people to this separateness and isolation. But he wrote a book called The Art of Loving in the 1950s. It's a wonderful book to read, and I recommend it to everyone who has time to go and find a copy because they're really hard to find now. But Fromm basically argues that we have to distinguish between love as an emotion and love as something active. And what does this mean for us? Well, he argues that love is something that we have to actively build. Fromm asks us to treat love as an art. Now, if you are not an artist, I can't draw, I cannot paint, I cannot do any of those things. But if I wanted to be an artist, I'd have to go and practice. I'd have to do those things every day until I get better. And Fromm urges us to treat love in the same way. Love is an art that requires practice. It's a verb, he says. It's not a feeling that we have. It's a doing. We do love. And when you begin to do love, you practice love. And when you practice love, you get better at doing love. He says love is a standing in, not a falling for. In its most general way, the active character of love can be described by stating that love is primarily giving, not receiving. It is something we do. Think of love not as an emotion, not as an experience, but as an action, as a verb. How do you practice love as an art form, as a verb? Well, Fromm talked about 4 different ways you can do this. The basis, or the kind of starting point, is to care for the other person. And that means love being an active concern for another person and for the growth of the other person. Not because you want them to be who you want them to be, but because you truly care about their well-being. Secondly, he argued that to love means you have to be responsible. Love is being able and ready to respond to the needs of the other person. It requires care of the other person, but you also have to be responsible for the other person's needs and feelings. And thirdly, it has to be based on respect. Fromm argued that if you have responsibility for someone else but no respect for that person, it becomes a domination of the other person. To truly love someone, you have to be able to be responsible for their needs, but also respect them for who they are, and allow them to grow and unfold in how they want to grow, not how you want them to grow. And finally, you have to have knowledge. And knowledge simply means knowing who they are and knowing what they need. Love is having knowledge of and concern for the needs of other people. You have to be able to practice all of these 4 things in order to love someone else. The feminist and anti-racist scholar Bell Hooks also took up this idea that we should be loving people based on how we act rather than how we feel. She argues that when we are loving, what it means is that we are honestly and openly expressing our care for someone else, our affection, our responsibility, our respect, our commitment, and our trust for that person. But she's also the individual who probably more than any other scholar has politicized the act of loving. She says that you cannot fully love someone within structures that limit what love is, under patriarchy, under capitalism, under all forms of discrimination. Love as an act cannot be cannot truly bloom. Love, she says, cannot exist as long as the desire to subjugate, to dominate, to oppress someone else still exists. So for Fromm and Bell Hooks, then, love isn't simply an emotion, it's an art, it's a skill that we have to practice. And when I say go and practice love, a lot of people kind of go, well, where do I start? How do I start this art of loving other people? And there is a very simple answer which is found in The Art of Loving. Towards the end of the book, Fromm says, to be able to practice loving other people, you first have to love yourself. All those things I talked about initially about care and knowledge and respect and kindness for other people, you begin by practicing those things on yourself. When you're able to show yourself unconditional love, Fromm says you'll be able to then go on and love other people. If you're unable to love yourselves, if you're unable to look into yourselves and know who you are, to care for yourself, to be responsible for your actions and to be responsible for your needs, then you're going to be unable to love yourself, but also unable to love other people. So you first have to love yourself. Hooks talks about the giving practice, and she argues that the giving practice begins with ourselves. If you want to practice giving to other people, you have to first be able to give to yourselves. And so many of us feel so unable to love ourselves at a very basic level that when we talk about love and wanting to love other people, why can't we start by loving ourselves first? Now, importantly, when we begin to talk about love in this way, when we talk about love as an art, as a skill, as something you can practice and you can build and you can develop over time, it also takes love away as something individualized. There is no specific form of love that I reserve for pizza versus the collective you versus my dog versus my partner versus my children. It's the same love that I'm talking about because it's based on the same principles. It's nothing weird, it's nothing strange here. It's the same type of love that I'm expressing and doing for other people. Now, learning to love in this way isn't easy. It's not easy because it requires introspection. It requires you to look into yourself and go, I don't like parts of me. There are parts of me that are hideous. There are parts of me that are difficult to live with. There are parts of me that I cannot stand. But that's what it means to be human as well. There will be parts of other people that you cannot stand. There will be parts of the communities that you cannot stand. There will be parts of entire human populations that you will go, I do not like this thing that other people have. But to be able to sit with that and go, I understand why I feel that way, that's what love is. That's where love comes from. It's a respect and a care that we build up. And because it's a care and something we can practice, it means that you can begin to express the same type of love for yourself, for your partners, for your dog, for your pizza, and more than that, for the communities that we hold dear to us, for the peoples that we hold dear to us. So for me, that's what love really is. It's not something individualized. It's love that we are able to do for whole groups of people. I've talked for a very long time, so I will finish there. There's lots of further reading if you'd like to do any. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
So if anyone has a question they would like to ask now, then I can bring the microphone to you. Please just put your hand up.
A technical question. Is this going to be available online?
And
thank you for the amazing.
Thank you. I don't think so.
Any questions?
Yeah. Hello. So I just got a question on self-love and how do you not fall into the trap of egoistical love?
How do you not fall into the trap of being egotistical if you love yourself?
Yeah.
That's a good question because there is a very fine line between narcissism and loving yourself because you think you're the best at something and loving yourself because it's a good practice to begin with. The best way to think about it is narcissism is based on unreal perceptions of yourself, and it's an arrogant perception of yourself. You only focus on the good bits, but you're not looking at the bad bits. And true giving practice begins by looking at all the bad bits and saying, I'm a holistic person, I have bad bits, I have good bits. And when you combine everything and accept the bad bits with the good bits, that's better than just saying, I'm focusing on the good bits only. There are lots of mindfulness-based techniques also that are very helpful with kind of sitting with who you are. Again, not necessary for everyone to do it. And if you like doing mindfulness, there are apps which will help you guide you through kind of loving practice, which is basically focusing on loving the bits about you that you may dislike.
Yeah, so when I hear the phrase like loving yourself, it feels like it implies that there is a part of myself that it's loving and another part of myself that's being loved. So is this to be understood like there should be two parts inside of me when I feel like I'm only one. So how is this to be understood?
So I probably push this to a very strong extreme, and not everyone has bad bits in them. I probably do. But if I'm honest, like we all have bits of us that we don't like, bits of us that we probably want to hide away, bits of us that we kind of look in the mirror and go, this is not who I want to be anymore. That's still you in the mirror. It's not someone completely different. It's not a different personality. It's not a different individual that you're looking at. It's the stuff that we all carry with us. It's shaped who we are. It shapes who we want to be. It shapes who we can become. But learning to accept ourselves holistically. The reason why we don't focus on those difficult bits is because they're difficult. A lot of the time it doesn't happen just because I say to you, go and do it. It doesn't mean you should go and do it. A lot of the time we have to do it with professional care, in therapeutic settings, with help from other people who are able to guide us through doing those things. So when I say we've all got these bad bits in us, I simply mean that we carry stuff with us that we may not want to look at directly a lot of the time. We put it in a box and we hide it in our psyches and we allow it to fester, but then sometimes it shapes who we are, it shapes our behaviors, it shapes our outcomes. I believe that everyone can be loved, but not necessarily in a healthy way. I think everyone can be loved because everyone is deserving of love. And because everyone is deserving of love, we owe it to ourselves to first work on those things that help us love other people in a healthy way as well. Once we work through those things individually, we're able to love other people in a healthy way, and that's the best form of love. Otherwise, what you have is what Freud used to talk about as a kind of punctuated love, a version of love that isn't full. It's a kind of constricted form of love that doesn't flourish and doesn't allow both you and the partner to flourish. Yes?
I think we've come to... Sorry. Well, I mean, I can be loud enough, I guess.
No, it's people online, that's it. So.
Yeah, so I think we come to a description of love, to a given description of love, but we are not negating, denying what we initially said. Those are the actual chemical things that enable me to have, like, to express that type of love. Is there, like, is there the possibility that I am literally, I am physically and biologically, I have a defect biologically, in such a way that some of those, like the balances of those chemicals is wrong under the normal circumstances, and that just disables my ability to gravitate towards this description of love?
So the premise of your question is a bit difficult to answer because it assumes that we put all those different chemicals into a bottle, we get love. But think of it this way: if you distill all those things and you put it into a potion and you get someone to drink it, they don't fall in love. Think of it in that way, because nothing is specifically triggering those neurochemicals at the same time in the same place. Now, for some people, for example, we know people might not experience the same highs with things like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. So they may not experience the kind of pleasure of love. Or you may have some people who have very low levels of oxytocin, and they may struggle to form social bonds with other people. The basis, though, is that these are requirements of love, because you're thinking about love as something that occurs in the brain. When you get past that and you think of it as love as, like I said, something that we do, then you don't need all those things in the brain. You may not experience love in the same way, because the things that are happening in your brain may be very different, but it doesn't mean you're not able to love.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I do appreciate it. So one thing I find really interesting is that you've kind of taken us through a journey of all these different theories with regards to love. And the key thing in amongst all of that is that it's a connection between two people or two or more people. And then I guess we've ended with the idea of obviously loving yourself is important as well. I was just interested to know whether you think that some of these theories are applicable in loving yourself, or whether there's other literature out there which kind of describes that differently. Because to this gentleman's question about neurochemicals, for example, is loving yourself, the rise of oxytocin and norepinephrine and all the other ones, or is it different?
The short answer is no. So, for example, we know that oxytocin doesn't play a role in self-love. Whether or not you love yourself makes no difference to the release of oxytocin. If you give people nasal sprays of oxytocin, they don't love themselves more than anything else. So it seems to play a role in loving other people or other individuals, not necessarily yourself. The color wheel of love has never been applied that I know of to individuals, to themselves. Sternberg's triangular theory as well. I don't think I've ever seen it applied to self-love. So the short answer that I'm aware, at least, is no. And I suspect the reason why that is because self-love is much more complex. It requires more than just passion and liking. And also thinking about Sternberg, actually, it wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't be in passionate love with yourself. I don't want to have sex with myself. So it probably wouldn't work in the same way. But yeah, I think the kind of compassion and liking element probably does play some role, that we want to be compassionate to ourselves. And in fact, there is a theory of self-compassion, which is widely used, and it's not necessarily based on Sternberg's theories, but it's based on one of the components of that theory. Yes?
Thanks very much. Really, really interesting talk. Is love at first sight a myth, or is there science underpinning that? And is there a median time which science supports that?
The answer to that question depends on how you define love. Helen Fisher used to talk about love at first sight being essentially lust at first sight. There was no real love at first sight. It was an infatuation that you feel. And that infatuation for her was triggered by certain neurochemicals in the brain. there is other qualitative research which suggests that people think about love at first sight and they're able to conceptualize this feeling, but often when they do that, what they really mean is they feel a great deal of attraction for someone. Love, as I said, requires love and requires care and respect and knowledge, and all those things do not exist without interaction. You have to interact with someone for those things to come into play. So if those things don't exist, then love at first sight cannot exist. So the short answer to your question is, if you ask a social psychologist, they will say it doesn't exist. If you ask a neuroscientist, they might say, well, it probably does exist in some form, depending on how you define love. But the caveat here is that people think it does exist. So you might think it exists, and it will shape how you behave in your life. So a lot of people, when they think it exists, they feel a greater deal of compassion and a greater deal of attachment to their partners compared to people who say it took time to develop, which is a strange thing. When people think in their brains, I fell in love at first sight with my partner, even though scientifically we know this is not possible, in their brains it's conditioning to behave in particular ways towards their partner.
Yeah, I wanted to know what is the current research involving the polyamorous love, and also like countries where men can have like more than one wife.
Yeah.
What? Yeah.
So there isn't really very much research, and a lot of the time what's happening now is that research is catching up with a change in how people love and how people express and form relationships with other people. There is some initial research to suggest that when people are in polyamorous relationships, they still are able to love multiple people at the same time, and that is still more or less based on Sternberg's model of love, that they're able to form consummate relationships and consummate forms of love with more than one person, which is a shift in the way in which we think about love, especially historically in Western Europe. When we think about consummate love in particular, we think of it as being expressed to one individual, but it seems to be the case at least that we're able to express it to multiple people at the same time. But a lot of the research that's being conducted on polyamory in particular is very recent. It's not really caught up with the change, particularly in young people's lives now.
Oh yeah, I just wondered if there's any kind of like evolutionary reasons behind why you need to kind of be able to love yourself before you can love others, and sort of all these kind of things, like whether there's, I understand there's something called group selection, which might not be in the human, but if you kind of love with a group, that improves the fitness and spreading your genes on kind of thing.
So there is a theory in evolutionary psychology which argues that love is essentially something that evolved over time in order to allow for pair bonds to develop. It allows two people to come together, and it essentially ensures that their genes are passed on to future generations. The specifics of that theory have been highly debated, primarily because it's typically applied to heterosexual couples, and it implicitly says that love cannot develop in the same way among same-sex couples, because theoretically they will not be passing any genes down to any future generations. So it's been highly controversial, the application of evolutionary theory to theories of love, or evolutionary psychological theories to theories of love. The evidence, more or less at the moment, is focused on seeing whether Sternberg's model of love is cross-culturally stable. The argument being that if it is cross-culturally stable, then there must be some conception of love that is evolutionarily stable and common across different cultures. The best evidence I've seen is based on university students, which is not representative. And so a lot of the kind of cross-national data is often saying, yeah, the Sternberg's model is brilliant, but then it's based on university students from lots of different countries. And there's no good data that I've seen that says it's cross-culturally and cross-nationally stable based on representative populations.
One more question?
It's one behind you.
Do you think the theories of love and what it is going to evolve into something else with more interpretations?
I think the science of love is going to be challenged. And I say that because conceptions of love, historically, we think of them as something stable. We think of them as unchanging. And that gives us almost a kind of comfort to think that it doesn't change. And it's easy to do because it doesn't change. But when we think of love as something dynamic, not just for the individual, but something dynamic in terms of how we understand love and how it evolves and how it changes across different communities and across time, then it becomes something much more complex. And human beings don't like complexity. We don't want it to be difficult. We don't want it to be difficult to understand and difficult to practice. But that's where the science is at the moment. It's trying to grapple with that understanding that love isn't always going to be the same, because communities define what love is, and it will change across time, it will change across communities. What I think won't change is the social psychological understanding of love, which is derived from. The understanding that love isn't simply an emotion, that it is a verb that we do. Now, how we do love might change depending on different situations, depending on the community that we're in, depending on who we're interacting with, depending on whether I'm talking about community, the collective view, or whether I'm talking about my son, or whether I'm talking about myself. So how we do it will change. But the fact is that we need to think about love as something that we do. That's not going to change.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if the neurotransmitters, would they be involved if someone is starting to have like a relationship like in faith with God and starting to love God?
To love God?
Like in our faith, in religion.
I do not know the answer to that question. It's a different type of love, I suspect, because it's based on a construct rather than a reality. So I don't have an answer to that question, sorry. There's one more, and then, okay. And I will let you all leave.
Yeah, it was just about the heart being the kind of, I guess, perceived
Seat,
as,
yeah.
yes, kind of where, I guess, feelings come from, love being one of them. Because I guess I'd never really thought about it before, but in relation to the neurotransmitter stuff, a lot of the physiological reactions we have when we feel intense feelings do affect our cardiovascular system.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've got any other thoughts regarding why that became the center of love, and I guess not.
So historically it wasn't. Historically it was actually the liver that was thought to be the center of love. So for a very long time it was associated with the production of bile. And bile was thought to be a thing that occurred or was produced when you fall in love, because it was a sickness. It wasn't something that we desired. You fall in love and your liver goes, I don't like this feeling, I'm going to produce lots and lots of bile, and suddenly you feel sick. So initially it was thought to be associated with the liver. And it was only because, like you say, when we think about love, at least how it affects our physiology, we feel the beating of the heart when we feel attracted to someone, our breathing starts to get a bit heavy. All those things have an impact on the heart. I suspect that a lot of what happened was, though, that someone somewhere went, it affects your heart, and then it got codified as, it affects your heart. And therefore, throughout history, it affects your heart. And I've always wondered this. We will never know the answer to this. You could go back in history, and if you write down at some point, write a book that says, love causes a change to your foot. You experience it in your foot, and it becomes codified, and it becomes codified as a literary tradition, as a cultural tradition, and now in the future, we're all saying, I feel it in my foot, because that's what we think. We've been told to think that way. So it's not, I don't think it's necessarily anything that really necessarily affects the heart in that sense. It's, we have been conditioned, we've been told since we were a child, it affects you in your heart, therefore now I feel it in my heart. But you can probably go to a cultural community who've never had that association, and you could probably do some research with them and say, where do you feel it? And they probably will go, I don't feel it anywhere. I feel it in my brain, or feel it in my fingers, feel it in my toes, I don't know, somewhere else.
Have you heard of Takotsubo's cardiomyopathy?
No.
Well, it's meant to be something that happens to your heart when you're in really serious distress. We call it heartbreak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can have such a strange physiological effect on the heart. That's what I was wondering whether, I guess you kind of see it more as interesting conditions.
I mean, you're making me question myself. I don't know is the answer, because I'm struggling to see it as not conditioning. I'm struggling to, like, if you watch cartoons when you're a kid, you see it in your heart, like Bugs Bunny's heart goes beating out of his chest, isn't it? Not his foot that's shaking. I don't know. Prof? Anyway, thank you all for coming. I hope you have a nice evening, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the festival.